All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of useR 2025. I hope everyone enjoyed the Nasher Museum last night and maybe got a chance to walk around Durham a little bit. We have a small city, but lots of little tiny pockets of niceness about it. So this morning, we have another keynote speaker that I am so excited to hear from. Professor Frauke Kreuter is the chair of statistics and social data science at LMU Munich, and she's also the co-director of the Social Data Science Center at the University of Maryland, as well as a faculty member in the Joint Program in Survey Methodology. She's currently past president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research and part of the National Academy's panel on the future of statistics. In addition to her academic work, Frauke is constantly trying to broaden the pool of people using data science. She brought DataFest to Germany. She's co-founder of the Coleridge Initiative, whose goal is to accelerate data-driven policymaking by enabling efficient, effective, and secure access to sensitive data about society and the economy, and co-founder of ADA, an applied data analytics program for government employees. We are so excited that Frauke is able to make the time to come out here and talk to us today. Can't wait to hear her talk.
Thank you, Mina. Oh, is this on? Thank you, Mina. Just checking with the, yeah, okay, now it's gone. It's very exciting to be here, and this was an unusual week for me because two things happened very recently before this talk that I really didn't expect. And very recently was last night, because I realized that the talk I'm giving today really is all about a community of practice. And I hope I can, you know, I've learned enough overnight from Yanni to hit on the right points to get you excited about this community, but at the minimum to make you aware that it exists and that there might be something that all of you can contribute. The other thing, maybe a little less positive, smiley, facey, was something that might have hit your inbox from Professional Association, or it might have hit your newsfeed. Last Friday, we as that community of practice of government statisticians were a little surprised at the firing of the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it really sent a ripple effect of discussion and outreach, not just within the US and the academic communities there, but also internationally. I was in Germany when that happened, and there too it was the conversation of a lot of people. And for those of you less familiar, with the federal statistical system, I will talk a little bit about it throughout, but also the challenges that are visible in this event that happened there, and I'll get back to that. One thing I do want to highlight is that the US, despite the criticism that we just saw, the US federal statistical system is really, I would say, world leading in its dedication to have good practices and principles on how they do their business, right? And the National Academies has just this year brought out a new a booklet on the principles and practices of the federal statistical agencies. And I would argue that all of these agencies hold themselves to the standards and the principles written in there. But some of these principles are challenging. And I underlined here two of them that I think we see faced a challenge in this recent event. One of them is the credibility of the data produced among the data users and stakeholders. Clearly, the current government thought they weren't credible. Data users now, subsequent to this event, might think they're not credible. And to be honest, a strong revision sends both signals, right? It sends a signal that we are credible because we learn new facts and we revise our numbers. That's a good practice and a good policy. But it also sends a signal that data that come out might be revised, and the revision could be strong, right? And that, of course, for those that use the monthly labor market data to decide on investments or anything, policies. I mean, not necessarily on a national level, but companies' decisions and things like that. For them, it is important that the revisions aren't so large, right? Because they're planning, and you don't want to like, oops, would I have known that 2 months ago? So these things really matter. They, we always say they move markets, but I mean this really in the broadest term. And the other challenge that I think these systems face, and that is a challenge that is not discussed on the front page of the news all the time, but the need for continual improvement that is part of the principles and practices is one that is challenging. I mean, that is there, but it is challenging if you're underfunded, or if you, the way the system is set up, just don't have the right people, or the right equipment, or the right tools, right? And so, as Mina mentioned, I've been involved in several programs and initiatives newly built that try to empower government employees to do their job better. But I also think increasingly it's a larger community that needs to contribute to this, because there's only so much these statistical agencies can do. And so this is the context of my talk here. There's also another community that increasingly cares about government statistics, even so they don't know it yet, is what I would argue. I was about a month ago, or whenever that was, a couple of weeks ago, in Canada at the ICML. It's a big machine learning conference. And I saw a lot of talks on alignment. That's the key word there, right? Alignment, making sure that these large language models report back or communicate with us in a way that's grounded in reality. And, this could be just, avoiding hallucinating about news, but there are a lot of realities where we have facts, where we have data, or where we have knowledge about norms and attitudes and values that we implicitly assume these language models should get right. And the machine learning communities, or those building these systems, also increasingly realize, well, we might not have the right data, and actually we don't know what we're trying to align with, right? Who is the population, whose opinions are reflecting there, and whose living standards and conditions. And you could imagine, someone interacting with the language model and, wanting pure facts, it's like, am I just imagining that the prices are going up, or are they really? And instead of visiting the Bureau of Labor Statistics website to see the inflation indices, they hope to get the answer from the language model. But you can also imagine that, a teenager trying to make family decisions or whatnot is sort of wondering, can I live this life that I imagine, and what will people think about that? And, to get a sense of norms and attitudes. There too, we have data, we know that, we know how to collect them. You heard earlier, part of the joint program and survey methodology, there's a community of survey people that try to do measurement well, and certainly has collected data of that type, which currently is not used at all to train any of these models because of its sensitive nature, right? There are a lot of people here that are part of the open data community, but most of you know that openness has a limit when we want to protect privacy of respondents, and so other ways need to be found, which for the training of these language models are yet to be developed. So this is the problem space that I want to talk about, and I want to, shed light on three perspectives in that problem space. One is for us to think about the type of questions that we are posing, where we want data as an answer, and what requirements these different types of questions pose on the quality of the data that goes in there. Then I want to reflect a little bit on the 80 plus years of survey research, which for a long time have managed to develop quality metrics and quality assurances in the way that also the Bureau of Labor Statistics relied on, that may or may not work these days with the kind of data needs we have and the kind of data sources we have. And then I want to make a pledge to all of you to join an increasing community of collaboration trying to make things better. And I couldn't think of a better place than this conference or this type of people sitting here in front of me to say that, because I find, useR or the data meetings or, any of these statistical software community meetings that I've been at, really inspiring, because rarely do I see people who are constantly thinking, okay, problem, where's the solution? How can I fix it? How can I build a tool? How can I build something that helps solve this problem? So that's the goal here. So when I think about use cases of statistics, it helps me to always sort of think about what are the things we're trying to do with data. And, part of the reason the machine learning community has in the past maybe not cared as much about data quality is their focus on prediction. And I would argue prediction is sort of the easiest of all the tasks. What do I mean with prediction? Prediction would be, I need to classify a tweet as being hateful or not so I can throw it out, right? And back then when there was still tweets. Or an advertisement, is this a picture that's likely going to be clicked on, and if so, I feed it, and if not, then I'll throw it out. I need to know a lot about the relationship between variables, but that's probably it. Right? A little harder is causation, and I know some of you work in that space, right? That is harder because I need more variables to begin with, and I need the right ones, and I need to think about confounders and all those things. But then there's, and I forgot to click my way through here. So sorry. Then there is the description task. Let's say, I want to know how many hateful tweets were there at the beginning, right? And that one, I would argue, is the hardest one. And why do I say that? Well, for tweets, we might know the universe and someone, but what about things that I measure on people? What about if I ask these same questions on depression? Like, can I predict if someone is depressed? Can I get to the causes? But then how many people in the US are depressed? Right? That is a very difficult thing to measure, and yet it might be very important if I make a policy decision on where the money should go, right? And we certainly had these very challenging questions during the COVID-19 pandemic when something new happens and we haven't developed measurement instruments yet that allow us to answer these questions very quickly, right? And so why am I making this claim that the first two might be a little easier than the last one? Statistically speaking, for the first one, all you need is a positive selection probability and the right variables in your set, right? And getting the right variables, of course, is a challenge too. But you might have an idea, or you don't, and the models tell you which ones hang together, whatnot. But in the descriptive task, the selection probability of each case that you use needs to be known. Right? You need to know what's the denominator and what's the nominator, right? And in a way, that the Stance 101 courses that we've seen lots of great ideas on how to teach about, that's the hardest statistic, in my view. Right? Seems easy, we're just counting, and but it's hard, and it's hard to get that right, and that's where the National Statistical Institutes come in, right? The Census Bureau still has a wonderful mission on its webpage, measuring America's people and economy. We believe in the power of quality data to impact public life. And this is really what it is, but it requires them counting right, if you will, right? At least some, and we all rely on the data they produce for that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, I use it as an example because, like the census too, but census we often associate more with the people, but on the BLS, certainly we think of companies and enterprises and what they do. And similarly, they have to get the universe right. They need to know what the population is to begin with. And then they have to help us define measurements that we all agree with work, and employment statistics is one that we often use when we teach statistics as being a difficult one, because what does it mean to be employed, right? And while all of you might know the current unemployment figures, maybe not all of you know what the definition is for employment, right? Stephanie does, but maybe not everybody, right? It means that you worked 1 hour for pay, 1 hour last month. That's as good of a definition as any. I mean, we could decide on a different definition, but it is a measurement that we've defined and needed. But when you interact with those that provide the data to you, they, can you assure they have the same definition in mind and so on, right? For the inflation numbers, the example that I mentioned earlier, you need two different pieces of information. You need to monitor the prices as they develop, but you also always need to know, what are people buying? What is the basket of goods that they're buying? For that, you need to ask the people or monitor them in some way, right? If we all were to use the same credit card from one company, then maybe we could monitor it that way, but only if the labeling of the data works properly, right? So there are alternative measurements in play, and certainly the prices, BLS is not longer going to stores and going to companies and have people write down the prices, which they actually used to do, but they are having shops and companies send scanner data to see what people purchased and what the prices were. But there's still an important survey, the consumer expenditure survey, where they go to households, sit down for an hour or 3, depending on how big the family is and how much they purchased, and ask, about each of the items, for whom it was bought, what was the price you paid for, did the price include tax or not. If you're still one of those that like to do surveys, try that one. Then you might not anymore. It's a laborious project, right? Yet we like the data that come out of it. We want to know, what is the inflation currently. We want to know, did the prices go up? Because again, it drives markets, it drives decision, it might drive an election. And then on the health side as well, I mentioned depression. The medical expenditure survey is just one of the many health surveys that are produced by the Federal Statistical System, and maybe produce data that people in this room have used. And the list could go on. The Federal Statistical System in the US is peculiar in the way that it's very decentralized. So most of the departments or branches of government have a separate statistical office, which is pretty independent, or ideally entirely independent. And there's some notable exceptions. The EIA, the Energy Information Association, always was part of the Department of Energy, more closely related than other of the agencies. But I always found it fascinating that these entities existed so independent in their organizational structure, grouped in the ICSP, the consortium of these statistical agencies, organized by the chief statistician of the United States, which sits within OMB and also recently has been replaced, can function as an entity that really has a lot of these elements that we heard Jan talk about yesterday, a community of practice. They're engaged in something they're passionate about. They're trying to constantly make it better. Some of you might have heard of the FCSM conference. It's the Federal Committee of Statistical Methodology. Each of the agencies has a representative there. Fantastic people, Jenny Hunter-Charles at Census or Morgan Erb at NCHS. They're super active in that community. All these people really match the criteria of trying to constantly improve the system. Now, I would say the community clearly suffered in DC during COVID and all the remote work and them not seeing each other and not working as closely. And the system is fragile, no doubt. It is also fragile for a couple of other reasons, and that's what I wanted to convey to you with this reflection on the 80 years of survey research. You would think if, so many decades research is done to improve a methodology, that it should be good by now. And certainly there's no shortage of textbooks and journals and associations that are really dedicated to getting a question in a survey right, to make sure that people do understand when I ask about employment, what that means, that get the sample design right. If I was too slow, Stephanie, to put your book up there. I wanted to change that title. And to improve the overall quality of the measurements. However, in the last decades, we also seen a trend that people just don't want to answer these surveys anymore. Not just people, also enterprises. The Bureau of Labor Statistics problem, in part, was that the responses just didn't come in time. But the principles and practices, and the standard norm is you have to produce these numbers every first Friday of the month, right? Whether you have the data or not. And so what do? You have an estimate based on past experiences. You make a prediction. But if data is missing and data is systematically missing, and you're relying on the past and the present is changing a lot, then the prediction can be off. For us as statisticians, the whole process is not surprising, but the ground is shifting underneath. And this is in part because survey participation, not just in the consumer price index survey that I have depicted here, and the current employment statistics surveys, both of these BLS surveys, have gone from a 70% response rates in 2015 over 10 years to a 40 or 35% response rate for the CPI. And the current employment statistics, you see the sort of changes over time. Some of these increases due to methodological changes, but now also down to about 40%. Right? And you all know, if the missing 60% are at random, okay, we'll have more people or less of a precision, but what we worry about if it is not. And it also would be okay if it weren't so darn expensive to collect these data, right? Here too, I had to chuckle when I was at that machine learning conference, because they're used to getting their data for very cheap. When I tell them that an interview survey like these ones, where an interviewer comes to your house and just sits there for an hour, that you can easily, be in a range of $150 to $1,000 per case. And I mean, that's just mind-boggling for someone who works with clicks or data streams that come very easily in some other context. So what am I worried about really at its heart is that we are moving to a place where we get the data from a different source. For example, the language models. We could just ask them how the population is doing, or we could create personas that answer survey questions. And there's a great team here at Duke. Actually, Lisa Argyle was first also on a paper that really made a big splash in the survey community. The title is "Out of One Many," with the idea that you could just, instead of asking people, you create personas that sort of match, the General Social Survey or any of the American Community Survey, American Election Survey, you name it. Give them the demographic variables and then ask a question. For example, what would you vote for? Right, that would be one approach. And what they found, at least for the US, that the answers actually mirror quite well what we would expect. Now, I, as a European, would say that's just because you guys have, only two parties, and so much is predictable on where people live and, what settings they are in and whatnot, right? And in fact, students of mine that tried to do this for Europe quickly saw it's not working at all, right? And when stuff changed, none of that surprising to the community, I'm sure. But the thing is, the survey community has also, maybe 10 years ago, when non-surveys that weren't based on a probability sample, where you would know the selection probability, became popular. We call them non-probability surveys. These are the Access Panel, these are the Prolifics and MTurks and you name it, platforms of this world. that no one would use it because the data are of unknown quality. Turns out everyone is using them, and even the most respected journals are now accepting papers as long as someone writes this data is a representative for the population. And what they mean with that is that it has a proper proportion of males and females and maybe some demographic, geographic variables that work. So we've given up in part because we cannot afford other measures, or we think we can't afford them. And that's why I think this creation of synthetic data has a fair chance to be used. I hope I'm wrong, but mark my words. And in certain instances, I think it should have a fair chance to be used, right? Back to that group at Duke, some of you might know Christopher Bale and his research group. They're doing fantastic work simulating social media, effects on people, evaluating different types of algorithms in news feeds and how people might respond to it. They're creating synthetic personas in the way I described before, and then change algorithms, see what happens, and so on. Susan Athy in her group over at Stanford, she's using these models to create synthetic data to plan studies and experiments. And, if you have complicated trials, or RTCs that you plan on doing, power calculations can be really difficult, right? But if you simulate the data and sort of see what would happen and put your assumptions in, you can learn a lot. So I do think there's a big role for them. And there might be a role in the prediction task. There might be a role in the causation task. But I really doubt that there's a good role in the description task. But no matter which task we want to use them for, all of them hopefully ensure that we have the right measurements, that the way the models respond to what we put in there, the question that we ask, and the people they represent are representative in the way that a statistician would use that word, right? So the two questions really are the measurements correct, and who responds or whose data is in it? And this is, not just for survey context, but also in any of the machine learning tasks when we try to apply a label to a data point, right? The whole image classification or videos or what have you. Someone has to decide, is this a dog or a cupcake? Is this whatever the favorite task is? And getting these labels correct, the dog cupcake thing might not depend on your political opinions, but if you measure try to label a hateful tweet, well, it depends on the context, it depends who says it depends on what I'm used to, it depends on how I speak, so much variation. So, and it does depend on how I am rating these tasks. If I see a whole bunch of hateful tweets before, and then the next one looks less strong, if I change the order, all of these things are things that, survey statisticians know measurement is hard, but in the way the data are collected right now is largely ignored, right? And similarly, it is ignored on who is in these labeling farms, who provides the data, how do we get that right? Again, an opportunity to apply some of the methodology we already used in other contexts, but it's also an opportunity to think anew, is like, what actually does constitute quality data? How do we capture that? What metric are we using for this? And the reason I'm pretty convinced that these online labeling farms, but also your favorite non-probability survey, is likely not capturing the population is that those that do try to measure it, like Pew Research, they found people who answer those surveys to be more likely to be in low income brackets, to be more likely to be single adult households, to be more likely to not have children in the house, those kind of things. Not surprising, because there's certain kinds of income situations that make you more likely to engage in these tasks than not. And again, for certain things, dog versus cupcake, fine, right? Probably okay. For other things, maybe not. Famously, the German government had some interest in estimating the proportions of click workers in Germany, so people who do online work, and they used a non-probability online sample to do so, right? Okay, it was cheap. They didn't have enough money. They needed the data fast. And sometimes when you need data fast, that might be the only source. But not surprisingly, the data weren't that good or stable. On the other extremes are data collections like the National Survey of Family Growth, which has been for a long time a test bed for innovations in survey methodology. And I remember Brady West and Jim Lepkowski and Bob Gross sort of pushing for this idea of monitoring response rates throughout the data collection. That's what you see here on the x-axis, the days in the field, and on the y-axis, the response rates for different subgroups. In black the various black females, males in different age categories, in white everyone else, and in between the Hispanics, also broken up by these categories. And when the team of survey researchers that monitored these saw certain groups lacking behind, right, then they have a choice. What do I do? Later on reweight the data, or maybe go out and try really hard to get at least some of those people, right? And so the decision there often was to, at day 70, to take a subset and then stratify that subset, take samples out of it, and for some, really try to get everybody from that group. Everybody. And the way they did this is they would plant the interviewer in front of the house to sit there and wait all day if needed until the person comes home so that they can ask at least a minimum set of questions. Right? Well, no wonder these surveys are so expensive. But it also means that you have a fair chance of estimating what are the values of those people that you don't have. Right? I haven't seen the language models do that yet, and the reason this is so important is, and the reason, you need to ask some of these questions, because it's not enough to know for a couple of demographic variables whether you have the people or not, right? Work by Bob Gross and Amelia Page-Chever a while ago showed for a whole bunch of surveys, every vertical line here formed by the dots is one survey, with the different response rates. On the x-axis are the response rates of the various surveys. This one, let's say, a survey with 65% response rate, and maybe, what is this, 15 items for which they were able to estimate the non-response bias, showing that for each survey item, the bias might differ, right? There was one item where it was very biased, but for the others, not so much, right? And the bias estimates here are all standardized on one metric so that they can be comparable across these. Why is that the case? Because for every single item, you would need to think about whether the mechanism that drives that respondent into the pool or that data into the language model is related to what you're interested in, right? And if I think about, attitudes and values of the world, and I'm thinking, okay, most of it comes from Reddit, some people are not in there, right? And some people are very loud, and other voices are not heard, right? And so getting that balance right is difficult. But what's even more difficult is to say upfront, well, this data is of that quality, and this data of that quality, right? And the survey community, I would say, got it wrong for a long time, because we would just talk about response rate as sort of the metric, when we know it isn't, and even after we realized it isn't, we still kept talking about it, and we still do in that same way, right? And so this is, I think, where the engineering ingenuity of this community really comes in. How can we do this better? How can we do this better, not just for the survey data collections, but maybe for alternative measurements that the federal statistical system could use? Data, 10 years ago, there was a big discussion on big data, and let's take all the data streams and whatnot. Right now, lots of initiatives to donate your data, meaning take everything from your cell phone and upload it somewhere, right? Or your entire WhatsApp feed or your entire Instagram history or whatnot, and then hope someone makes some sense out of it. I'm part of the people trying this, but I'm skeptical in part because lots of noisy measurements. But we're trying different data streams because we know it's hard to get to people directly. No one wants to answer survey questions, and I'm sure there are other measurements. In fact, the Census Bureau I mentioned earlier, they have a lot of initiatives on the business and economic statistics side where they work with companies to upload their employment data. There are also a set of 5, 6, 7 software products out there for HR. Well, if you have good APIs to get those data, you don't need to ask how many people work in this segment and on this segment and how many did you hire last month, right? So the problem though is that the modeling part's much more fun, right? All the energy goes into better models, better statistics and whatnot, not necessarily the prep work on the data, and I was chatting with Mina yesterday over lunch. Data Fest every year, people, the students are confronted with a new data set. And then there are so many questions on what does that variable mean and why might they be missing data on what, like in this category, do I understand that? And ideally, you have someone in the room or online who was part of that data generating process and can answer the students' questions, right? And I remember we were once working with government employees on statistics from prisons, trying to estimate probabilities of finding a job afterwards and whatnot. And the data that the administrative data that the prison had a whole bunch of categories, and one variable didn't perform as well as we thought. And then one of the participants who works at that agency responsible for the data said, "Oh yeah, well that's what we changed the definition of the categories in 19 whatever." Right? Well, if you don't know that, how could you get it right? And so this is the difficult part, and the difficult part is that it affects every single variable, right? If you think of big data archives like ICPSR in Michigan, according to their website, they have more than 350,000 files, data sets there available, right? Some of them are, I'm sure, fantastic. Some of them maybe not so, but even in the fantastic ones, there might be variables that aren't, right, for the reasons we just discussed. And the existing transparency initiatives like that of APO, I mean, they encourage the data collectors to report what they do on certain metrics, but it's disconnected. It's not that you would see the information that's gathered in the transparency initiative from APO with the data set as you download it and do stuff with it, right? And think about all the things you need to do these days. So in the past, we would have census or, whatever agency develop a new way to measure gender, right? Or a new way to measure race and ethnicity. Takes about 5 years to do that, lots of community engagement to get that right. But then you have it. Then you have your measurement. You go out in the survey, and then the analysis of that is easy. The data donation or other data streams, all the work happens on the back end. It's all out here. You have to make decision after decision after decision what to do with those funny data, and do they mean anything or not? And let's say you take a step count, right? And then you realize, oh, there's this a missing gap. Was everyone sitting in a conference, or was the battery dead, or is it a woman who has the phone in the purse and the purse is sitting but the woman is walking? I mean, there's a lot of interpretation needed to get those data streams right, and decisions are made in the data, but they're not tracked. We don't have good metadata schema for all those other data streams. The National Academy of Science had a panel a couple of years ago trying to at least get the metadata right for the survey and normal data production processes, right? But as great as this report is, it's a far cry on getting us good schemas and metadata for all the other data streams. And ultimately, what we really need is trust, right? So I was pleased to see a presentation, or actually I wasn't there, but I saw the slide deck from Gary King and colleagues at Harvard, who around the data wars are trying to find new ways of getting things attached to the data that convey a little bit whether we can trust them, right? So data tags, data label, that maybe the solution is a simple schema. It's like, okay, yeah, this variable, this item, you can trust, this data point not. Could be a start for helpful data processing. Um, it it might not have all aspects, and so they were propagating and pledging to going forward to expand sort of the notion of trusted data labels, that they get attached when they signal fitness for reuse, when they work for a specific community. The US Census Bureau, when Rob Santos was still director of the US Census Bureau, tried something similar. They realized that certain variables, how they measured, income sources and resources people have, doesn't work for tribal communities, and maybe they should have different ways of measuring that, to measure the capital that people have, because the strengths of weak ties, we didn't used to quantify them, but maybe that should also go into an economic survey. So the measurement quality has many different aspects, and you need this community engagement to get that right? To have a forum, a way for people beyond those working in the federal statistical system to say, yes, this measures what it should be measuring, and yes, we are all there, we are all representative, right? To have a notion of the provenance of where that data stream is coming from, right? And so the trusting the data, I think I love that this community here came around to calling it that, because I think it's impossible for every single one of us to know and to be able to reflect on how was that done and understand every single step, right? No, we want entities that we can just know, okay, we trust it. It comes from there, we trust it, right? Or it has a label, we trust it. And for a long time, the federal statistical system had that, right? And we know these principles and practices, and so we trust it. But if they now rely on other data sources, if it's not all the surveys where they're in full control, so the trust is justified, but if they have to rely on scanner data, on other software, on data streams, on administrative data, on health records, what have you, then all of a sudden we have to all trust each other that the data streams we create have good provenance, right? And sometimes we know they don't, and then we should have ways to signal that. And so, that's the one part of the thinking. So what is the right metadata? The other part of the thinking is, can we measure or see trust by seeing that the data is used a lot, right? The usefulness of the data, but also the signal that, okay, yeah, people trust the data because they're using it, is another aspect of this equation, right? And Julia Lane really has pushed this over the last couple of years a lot in a new initiative called Democratizing Data, and a book that goes with it, a manifesto that goes with it. And it was an interesting idea because, these federal statistical systems, they invest a lot of time and resources to collect data, but they don't know often how the data is used. They have difficulty in communicating that to the stakeholder. And also in these big data sets, which of the variables are really the ones important? Which data are people trusting? And so they went out and collaborated with publishing companies to automatically, read through journal articles and to see, what is the data usage. And let's see if I can get this up quickly enough. So if you go to the Democratizing Data AI website, you'll see the live update, in this case here for employment statistics, of papers using certain data sets, let's say LEHD. Who are the authors? What are the titles? What are the topics? Which journals are they published in? Where do the people sit that work in it and whatnot? To sort of work towards seeing that community of people trusting the data. How is the data work? So as one additional indicator that can be used. And many of the data sharing platforms like OpenML have ways for us as community to endorse data points, to make comments. And I wouldn't say it's quite yet in, sending your improvement suggestion to a GitHub page, right? But along those lines, right? And ideally, you could imagine that any one of us who's touching a data set makes a decision, sees something in the data, can add a tag, can add some additional information so that the next one who reads the data in gets that information automatically. And there are, initiatives that at least on the metadata side try to do that right now. I think it came out last year, or at least I was aware of it last year. Um, a metadata format called Croissant. It's coming out of the machine learning community to automatically read in information about the data. Though to my knowledge, it's not at the variable level. It's just at the data set level itself. Good first step, but not on the variable level. And so I wonder, how would need our package to look like that allows users to do that? As I work with the data set, get ideas, or even just to properly document what I'm doing, reproducibility. I mean, we often have the problem that it's just too much work to afterwards then also write all these decisions somewhere, right? Or have a data dictionary and it might be in there. But as you recode a variable, can you add a tag that explains why you did it and what the rationale is and what have you, right? Like, how do we get that provenance information attached to the data set and in the data set so that it's not so much extra work, because no one wants to do it afterwards, right? It needs to be easy. And so if you find yourself as someone's like, okay, I can do this, I have an idea. There's an opportunity in Germany. The German government is funding an initiative right now called CODAX. It has a guest researcher program. If you want to visit us, anywhere between 5 days and 6 weeks, can write a proposal and get your way paid. There's also a workshop next year on this topic on January 22nd if you want to come to Munich. These two things don't have to be combined, but just an idea. And obviously, here too, the federal statistical system has lots of interest in collaborating people that have ideas. Many of the agencies have programs that allow cooperation with academics, and everyone is hungry for good ideas. So, in summary, I hope I reinforce the notion that key policy decisions hang on good population statistics. I think we haven't quite given up yet that this could be all data free. But the high quality data that we need don't just happen, and the mechanisms that we used in the past to collect them don't always work still in the way we want it. And I think, I hope we can talk over the break or over lunch about opportunities and investments we can make to bring down the cost of tagging and information information to the data about the provenance, about the data generating processes, and maybe also to increase the incentives to document this in a way that the R community, and we heard last night, does so wonderfully, that people want to contribute, they want to be good reviewers, they want to, as you all, add additional packages, because we realize we can do this better together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frauke, for the talk. So the QR code is up there if you have questions and you want to scan it, or you can go to wooclap.com. useR25 is the ID. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that have already come in. Why do you think the response rates to these surveys are falling? And do you think it might be due to polarization within communities, or more mistrust of the government, or something else?
So probably all of the above, and over time, different elements to it. What we know is that the first dip of response rates just had a more random nature, I would say, and had to do with accessibility of the respondents, right? If you have smaller households, they are harder to reach. You know, if you try them at home, if you advent of mobile devices, things changed. But if initially, if you try household surveys, and a lot of the statistics are pegged to a household, so you ideally have a frame that includes the households. So if you only have a 1 or 2 person household, then it's really that person. If it's a larger family, then you can make appointments and reach someone, right? But this also means that household size is for some surveys related to a lot of the outcome variables. For certain variables, it might not matter, but for some, it does, right? For the government surveys, it was for the longest time the case that there was sufficient trust in the government that it felt like, okay, this is a survey where I would answer to, right? So once you reach them, the refusal on the doorstep was not the biggest problem, right? And that, of course, is changing, and it's changing differently in different settings and on different topics. And a contested topic like immunization might have a harder time than other topics, right? But we have seen this trend of declining response rates, not just in the US, but in a lot of countries. And over time, increasingly, we have very little data to measure. Is that a result of survey fatigue, that people just were in too many surveys, right? But that's very hard to measure because, again, how do you count the denominator? We just don't know how many surveys there are out there. So there are many hypotheses, but the important one is that we, for every given survey, need to think about, do we think the drivers affect the outcome variables or not? Is there a relationship between them?
People aren't answering questions. Is it better to look at other metrics such as social media posts?
So I mentioned earlier that 10 years ago there was this big data wave, and reading out Twitter or social media in general to get population statistics was very popular, including the unemployment statistics. There was a group in Michigan that tried to do that, and it was just like the flu statistics that CDC did out of the Google searches. Initially a big success until it wasn't. And this is in part because the data generating process is unknown, right? And if Google changes the search algorithm or the search bar, and some of you certainly old enough to know that at some point these predefined suggestions appeared so that you have to type less, right? And that was when that system broke, because then you have other keywords that people like, yeah, it wasn't exactly my question, but I just hit, and then you get that. And so similarly with the tweet, it just didn't work. The direct words or the correlates of it didn't work. So yes, I do think some can be replaced. I would put my money on administrative data streams over the social media data streams. But I think ideally we triangulate and use a couple of different ones. I could imagine using certain data streams as an early warning that something is changing. Let's say I use my model to adjust missing unemployment data or company reports, and get signals from the environment. Well, how much has hiring decisions changed given tariffs or what have you? Then maybe I build different models, right? So I don't think they can replace it, but I think they certainly could augment.
So, civil society in Argentina rescued data shared by the government for fear that the new government would unpublish it. But the biggest challenge was not technological, but social. How do we give credibility to this data? The credibility before was given because they were official data, but you mentioned now the official also has credibility crisis. Do you see a solution to this problem?
Wow, that's a tough one. So first, a footnote on Argentina. It's actually an interesting case because inflation statistics in Argentina was one of it's sort of the prime example for or motivation for these alternative measurements for government statistics, because there were a time where the inflation numbers produced by the statistical agencies there were less trustworthy than we would hope they are. But you can, if you know the basket of goods, at least the prices you can measure online, right? And even if you don't have all prices online, let's say services didn't used to be online as easily as shoes, right? You could still say, well, if the difference in development over time between service work and products isn't, vastly changing, then if I can measure the product changes, I can, impute the service changes. And so outside entities like the MIT Price Index, Billion Price Project, scraped those data and created alternative indicators, right? The trust in these indicators comes in part from the use, right? If it then turns out to be predictive, if it then turns out to be actually mimicking a development that you see, that builds trust. And this is, I think, why the democratizing data idea is so powerful. And it's certainly even more powerful if we think beyond published articles that take a long time to be published and whatnot. I mean, this is the nucleus of the idea, but you could imagine this to be a much more active community. I mean, if every GitHub repo post, would have a signal of this data was used and this was done with it and this assumption was made, that sort of magically in the cloud, forms this, sea of trust in certain data because we use it and it's useful. That would be pretty powerful. And so that's why I think the next iteration is probably much more bottom up than top down.
One last question for you. What suggestions would you have for undergraduate and graduate statistics and data science programs to better incentivize students to pay more attention to data collection as opposed to an overemphasis on data modeling?
Yeah, we used to have this undergraduate program, like a junior fellow program, where we would place them in statistical agencies to learn about this work. And unfortunately, many of these internship programs in the DC area have sort of COVID-related vanished or are not as fun anymore. As I said, the keynote last night, and anyone online who is watching this also watched that other video, really inspired me, because here too, I think it's that notion of community. If you can find ways for them to have an internship and exposure to this data generating pipeline that results in really important statistics. And this is what I think the official statistics has in it. It's valuable work, right? Then all of a sudden I saw, a lot of students generate interest in, okay, I want to be part of that process. I want to make that better. And so exposure, I think, and a community that values this interaction is the first step.
Wonderful. There are a few other questions, but we're running out of time. So if I may, I'll encourage folks to stick around and chat over the break. And let's give a huge round of applause for this wonderful talk.